A billionaire grew furious when his baby wouldn't stop crying mid-flight until a poor black boy stepped in and calmed the child with ease. Minutes later, the billionaire made a decision that changed the boy's life forever. What happens next will leave you speechless. A billionaire scowled at his own crying child, powerless at 30,000 feet. Then, a poor black boy stepped forward with nothing but kindness. Subscribe if you believe heroes can come from anywhere. The infant's scream shattered the illusion of calm like a pane of glass struck by a stone. The cabin lights had just dimmed to a soft glow, the hum of the engine steady beneath the silence when Elias Vaynor's wails rose like sirens piercing the altitude-thinned air. Alaric Vaynor sat frozen in his private suite, the leather armrest beneath his palm creaking under the pressure of his grip. This was supposed to be a seamless, distraction-free flight, 14 hours of peace en route to Zurich, where a billion-dollar merger awaited his signature. Instead, he was pinned in place by the smallest force imaginable, the relentless cries of his own son. He tried not to react at first. For the first 10 minutes, he merely stared out the window, jaw clenched, fingers tapping a slow, controlled rhythm on the armrest. But the cries didn't subside. They sharpened. They throbbed. They cut through the murmur of steward announcements and dulled the chime of service bells. Passengers in neighboring first-class suites shifted in their seats. Some adjusted their noise-canceling headphones. Others cast sidelong glances toward the Vaynor suite, not bold enough to complain but clearly displeased. Alaric exhaled through his nose, the breath sharp, controlled, meant to quell the growing agitation inside him. He looked down at Elias, cradled in his arms, squirming with tiny fists flailing, red-faced and inconsolable. The child had refused the bottle, rejected the pacifier, tossed aside the silver rattle engraved with his initials. His cries weren't the whines of minor discomfort. They were full-throated, furious, exhausting. Alaric adjusted his grip, gently rocking the infant, his voice low and even. Elias. Shh. Calm now. You're safe. But the soothing failed to land. The boy's screams only grew more frantic, as if his tiny lungs were fueled by something deeper than discomfort, something primal. Two of Alaric's personal security men, seated discreetly just beyond the privacy divider, exchanged a silent glance. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Lowell, half rose from his seat, hesitant, but a slight flick of Alaric's hand told him to stand down. This wasn't a security issue. This was something worse. This was personal. Alaric had built Vaynor systems from the ground up. He had navigated hostile takeovers, late-night collapses in server security, and backstabbing boardroom politics. He had been called the ice architect of Silicon Row, known for his unnerving calm under pressure. But now, cradling a screaming infant at 35,000 feet, his legendary control was cracking. Not publicly, not yet, but within. Something was splintering. His vision blurred slightly from the rising tension in his temples. The attendants came and went, each one offering some solution, warm milk, white noise headphones, a specially formulated baby balm from the amenities cart. Nothing worked. Elias refused them all, his voice now raspy from overuse, but no quieter. And Alaric's own heartbeat had begun to thud in his ears, matching the rhythm of his son's agony. "Sir," one of the male attendants began, hesitant as he leaned just inside the suite. "Perhaps the child is sensitive to altitude changes. We could ask the flight doctor to—" "I don't need a doctor," Alaric snapped, his voice a notch too sharp, too fast. The attendant backed away immediately, nodding and retreating without another word. Silence fell for half a second. Then another long wail from Elias ripped through the cabin. Alaric's jaw tightened as he stood up, shifting the child's weight in his arms. He walked a slow, measured circle in the suite, trying to rock Elias into calm. But it wasn't working. He had exhausted logic, used up options, and now he was left staring at the limits of his own power. He glanced toward the exit of the private suite and caught a glimpse of a man in business class covering his ears in visible annoyance. Alaric could feel judgment press in from all sides, cloaked in silence but no less crushing. The billionaire who could bend markets with a whisper now stood powerless in the face of a baby's cry. His thoughts spiraled. What would the press say if someone on this flight decided to leak footage? Tech Titan melts down at 35,000 feet. Would his board see this as a crack in his armor? Would his rivals, particularly Hector Dane, use this as ammunition? He paced again. The usual coolness in his features had given way to a heat rising up his neck and across his face. He didn't sweat, he never sweat, but now the collar of his tailored black shirt clung slightly at the throat. He cursed himself inwardly for not bringing the nanny. He had insisted on privacy, solitude, believing he could manage the child on his own, just this once. And now? Now, he looked like a man undone. He sat down slowly, every muscle tight, and stared at the child in his arms, now kicking gently, sobs slowing to hiccups but still loud enough to keep the cabin restless. His head throbbed with questions he didn't know how to ask. Why wouldn't Elias respond to him? Why, of all moments, was this happening now, on the eve of the biggest deal of his life? He felt something foreign rise in his chest. Not just frustration, humiliation, and worse than that, a creeping doubt. What if he wasn't meant for this? What if fatherhood was the one system he couldn't master? His eyes flicked back to the sealed suite door, his expression carved from stone. But within, there was a fault line trembling. The wail of a baby should never shake an empire, he thought bitterly, tightening his hold on the small body in his arms. Yet, here I sit, undone by my own bloodline. He didn't yet realize that in that fragile moment, when his control unraveled and his pride sat exposed like a raw nerve, the direction of his entire life was about to pivot in ways no wealth could predict. The storm, in the cabin, was only just beginning. The cries pierced through the cabin like jagged glass. They weren't soft or spaced. They were desperate, sharp, and unrelenting. Darius Holt sat motionless, 3 rows behind first class, his back pressed straight against the stiff economy seat as the infant's wail echoed above the murmurs of discontent. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, brows furrowed, some groaning beneath their breath. One man tugged his noise-canceling headphones tighter, another flipped the page of his business journal with exaggerated annoyance. But Darius didn't look away. His eyes were fixed on the source, an infant cradled awkwardly in the arms of a sharply dressed man who, despite his impeccable suit and polished demeanor, looked like he was unraveling by the second. The billionaire. Alaric Vayner. Everyone knew the name. Darius recognized him from the newspapers his school counselor used to stack near the office. He had never expected to see him in real life, let alone share a plane. The man looked powerful, poised, but now that image cracked. Sweat shimmered faintly at his temple. His grip on the child was unsure. Each failed attempt to comfort the baby only deepened the lines on his face. And the child, Elias, cried louder, more frantic with every passing second. Darius's chest ached. Not from the noise, but from something older, something he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Memories stirred of cold nights with the screaming brother in his arms, no milk left in the bottle, no power in the building. He remembered holding his youngest sibling against his chest and whispering lullabies over the sound of sirens outside the window. Calming a child wasn't a trick for him. It was survival. And now, watching the great Alaric Vayner flinch with every wail, Darius felt an old instinct return. But instinct clashed with fear. This was first class. That was a billionaire. And Darius, he was a charity seat. His name wasn't on the main list. A last-minute donation from some distant scholarship fund had landed him a spot on the plane. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too large and shoes that rubbed his heels raw. He had been invisible until now, and invisibility had kept him safe. Speaking up meant breaking that safety. It meant risking humiliation. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the armrests, preparing to stand. But his legs refused, locked with uncertainty. He watched as 2 flight attendants whispered near the curtain that separated cabins, glancing toward the billionaire and his screaming child. One seemed nervous. The other checked a tablet, likely reviewing potential passenger complaints. Darius could feel the tension crawling up the walls of the plane, invisible but suffocating. Then Elias let out a scream so sharp it cut through Darius like a blade, and without thinking, he stood. A sudden hush fell around him, not loud enough to silence the engine's drone or the baby's cries, but enough that the air changed, as if the plane itself paused to see what this boy would do. He stepped forward, slowly, 1 row, then another. Each step felt heavier, like walking through water. He could feel eyes on him now. Disbelief, suspicion, even amusement. Alaric looked up, drawn by the motion. His eyes, ice blue and lined with exhaustion, met Darius's. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The billionaire's jaw clenched slightly as if preparing to dismiss him. But Darius didn't falter. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice calm but carrying over the noise. "Sir," he said, "may I try?" The silence that followed was louder than the baby's wails. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the attendants froze mid-step. The sentence had landed like a spark in a room full of gas. It wasn't rude, it wasn't arrogant, but it was bold. A 16-year-old boy in worn shoes offering to help the most powerful man in the cabin. The absurdity was clear, and yet the sincerity in Darius's eyes made it impossible to laugh. Alaric narrowed his gaze, studying him. His lips parted slightly, maybe to reject, maybe to scoff, but nothing came out. Elias shrieked again, the sound cracking through his father's bones. Darius stood firm, hands at his sides, not pleading, just offering. And, for a heartbeat, the entire plane hung in that moment, waiting to see what the billionaire would do. What happens when poverty dares to offer a gift to power? Alaric's jaw tightened as the boy stepped forward. The billionaire's grip on the armrest was iron-like, knuckles pale against the polished leather. His eyes, cold and sharp, locked on the frail figure now daring to enter his domain. Darius Holt walked slowly, each step forward a silent defiance of the invisible walls built by wealth, power, and hierarchy. The first-class cabin was silent except for the soft whimpers of Elias, the baby's face red and contorted from exhaustion and distress. The passengers, once full of disapproval, now watched with thinly veiled curiosity, some whispering, others leaning forward as if drawn into a theater scene none of them had expected to witness. Alaric's instincts screamed at him to dismiss the boy. It would be easy to lift a single hand, utter a single word, and crush this strange act of charity like an insect. But Elias's cries were unrelenting, clawing into his thoughts, unraveling whatever control he still had over the moment. The billionaire's pride faltered, not shattered, but cracked enough to let hesitation creep in. Darius stopped just short of Alaric's seat. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "May I try?" he asked again, eyes not pleading, but steady with purpose. There was a pause. Alaric's lips curled slightly, somewhere between a sneer and a question. His pride bristled. What would it look like to let this ragged teenager, dressed in threadbare denim and a faded hoodie, handle his son? What would it mean for the man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts to accept help from someone whose entire life probably cost less than a single cufflink he wore? But Elias screamed again, a sound so sharp and desperate it cut through the silence like shattered glass. The weight of the moment collapsed in on itself. Alaric gestured stiffly, flicking his fingers in reluctant permission. The cabin shifted as though the very atmosphere changed. Darius moved with surprising gentleness, his arms reaching out as though handling something sacred. Alaric hesitated, his hands lingering on Elias a heartbeat longer than necessary, but at last he released the child. Darius cradled the baby with an ease that felt practiced, not rehearsed. His palms supported Elias's head, and his fingers curled instinctively around the child's back, adjusting the angle just right. The crying did not stop at once, but Darius didn't flinch. He began to sway, slowly, as though recalling some quiet rhythm older than memory. His voice, low and steady, hummed a soft tune. No words, just sound. Something between a lullaby and a heartbeat. A pattern carved not from music lessons but from long nights on creaking apartment floors, whispering to his brothers under the weight of sirens and hunger. Alaric watched with frozen breath. The transformation was subtle but immediate. Elias's cries dulled to hiccups, then to small gasps, and finally to silence. The boy's tiny hands unclenched. His head nestled into the hollow of Darius's chest, cheek resting against the rough fabric of the boy's sweatshirt as if it were the softest silk in the world. Gasps moved through the cabin like wind through dry leaves. One of the flight attendants in the corner clutched her clipboard a little tighter, mouthing something in disbelief. A businessman nearby blinked as though unsure whether to applaud or apologize. Even the bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, casting glances at each other with awkward respect. But Alaric felt none of their awe, only a strange and sudden knot forming in his throat. He leaned back in his seat, one hand now free and useless on his lap, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Relief washed over him first. The silence, so long denied, had finally returned. But instead of triumph, he felt hollow. Then came the shame, not directed at the boy, but at himself. How had he, with all his influence, been powerless before the cries of his own son? How could this stranger, this boy, command peace where he had failed. "What's your name?" Alaric asked, voice lower than usual. "Darius," the boy replied without looking up. "Darius Holt." "And how did you know how to do that?" Alaric's tone wasn't skeptical. It was curious, raw, open in a way that startled even himself. Darius adjusted Elias slightly, not missing a beat in the rhythm of his gentle sway. "Raised my brothers after my dad vanished," he said simply. "I've been calming crying kids since I was 8. The answer landed like a quiet punch. Alaric's eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in thought. There was no pride in the boy's voice, no complaint, just fact, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to bear the weight of a parent at an age when most boys barely carried their own school bags. For a long moment, Alaric said nothing. He studied the boy's posture, his calm, his unfazed composure in a room filled with wealth and silent judgment. He watched Elias breathe evenly now, small chest rising and falling against the chest of a boy no one had expected to matter. A strange heat burned in the billionaire's chest. Not anger, not envy, something else. Admiration, perhaps. Humility, certainly. In that moment, Alaric Vayner, the man who built an empire by mastering every detail and dominating every boardroom, realized he had just been outdone in the most human skill of all, fatherhood. And for the first time in many years, he felt respect. Not toward a competitor, not toward a shareholder, but toward a boy from nowhere who had just reminded him what true strength looked like. A small smirk tugged at the edge of Alaric's lips, dry, unpracticed. "Well," he muttered half to himself, "seems I've got something to learn." The boy didn't respond. He just kept swaying, holding the child as though nothing in the world mattered more. Outside the sealed windows, the world was still black with night, stars strewn across the sky like scattered diamonds. But inside the cabin, something unspoken had shifted. An invisible thread stretched between two lives that were never meant to intersect. In the hush of a silenced cabin, a seed was planted that would grow into an empire's greatest change. Turbulence jolted the aircraft without warning. Trays rattled, silverware clinked violently, and overhead compartments groaned against the sudden shift. Gasps echoed through the cabin as passengers gripped armrests and exchanged nervous glances. Elias stirred in Darius's arms, his little face scrunching as his body tensed with the first sign of a cry. Alaric tensed too, his eyes snapping toward the boy, panic flickering behind his carefully composed expression. But Darius didn't flinch. He adjusted his grip, rocking Elias gently while leaning forward just slightly, shielding the child from the cabin lights now flickering above. His voice emerged in a low hum, steady, warm, a melody without words but full of comfort. Elias calmed almost instantly, the potential whale retreating like a tide. Darius's eyes stayed focused on the baby, his expression one of complete concentration, like nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. Alaric stared. He hadn't spoken since the boy sat beside him. He had invited Darius up with the vague curiosity of a man trying to understand an anomaly, a poor teenager who'd done what wealth and a full crew of attendants could not. But what he saw now was something different. Not a fluke, not luck, a gift. Darius caught his glance but didn't speak. He simply continued humming until Elias's breathing evened out and his tiny fingers curled into sleep. Only then did the boy raise his eyes and say, "Turbulence spooks them sometimes. It's the sudden movement. Makes them think something's wrong." Alaric blinked. "And how would you know that?" "Same thing used to happen to my brother Marcus. He'd get scared if a truck drove by too fast outside our place. He'd cry just like that. Darius didn't add anything more. He didn't need to." Alaric shifted in his seat, discomforted, not by Darius but by the quiet truth of his words. This boy had lived through things Alaric hadn't even imagined, and he had turned those experiences into something useful, something powerful. Alaric, who could speak in boardrooms to investors controlling billions, found himself unsure of what to say next. "Tell me about your brothers," he finally said, folding his hands in his lap. Darius glanced down at Elias again before nodding. "3 of them. I'm the oldest. When my dad left, well, someone had to keep food in the fridge. I worked after school. Gas stations. Kitchen prep. Once I cleaned buses. Marcus, Caleb, and Noah. They're younger, but they've got heart. We made it work." His voice held no complaint, just quiet pride. His eyes never looked away from Alaric's, even when he spoke of things most grown men would hide behind excuses or silence. Alaric leaned back slightly, stunned at the boy's composure. "You did all that alone?" he asked more sharply than intended. "No one else was going to." Darius shrugged. "Mom tried, but when she got sick—" I took over. Alaric exhaled slowly, unsure whether he felt admiration or guilt. The contrast was blinding. His empire of glass and steel, and a boy whose strength was forged from necessity and love. He realized, bitterly, that Darius possessed a kind of power no currency could replicate. Passengers nearby continued murmuring, some glancing toward Alaric and the boy, but most assuming the billionaire was delivering a lesson, not receiving one. That was the irony. Every polite nod in their direction, every deferential glance, came from a misunderstanding. Alaric wasn't the teacher. He was the student. Outside the window, the sky had deepened into velvet blue. The jet sailed through clouds now smoothed by the stabilizers, and the once jarring turbulence faded. But inside Alaric's mind, storms swirled stronger than ever. He studied the boy beside him. Darius's shoes were frayed, one sole nearly detaching. His shirt, though clean, bore faint threads of wear, but his posture was straight, his voice measured, his presence undeniable. There was no bitterness, no plea for pity, only truth. "You've never flown before, have you?" Alaric asked. Darius smiled faintly. "First time?" "You're calm." "I've had worse." Alaric nodded, letting silence hang between them. Then, as if the thought had simmered to the surface uninvited, he muttered under his breath, "You have a gift, boy." More valuable than gold, Darius didn't respond, but his expression shifted, softening just slightly. He looked back down at Elias, whose hand had now curled gently around the fabric of Darius's shirt. Alaric stared at them both, the corners of his mouth twitching with a tension he didn't fully understand. This moment, this quiet, unspectacular calm, felt more meaningful than any quarterly gain or strategic win. And somewhere deep within, beneath layers of armor forged by ambition and pride, something cracked open. Little did he know that the turbulence wasn't just in the air. It foreshadowed storms ahead that would test both of them beyond imagination. Sometimes destiny arrives in whispers, not in thunder. Imagine that, the mighty Alaric Vaynor, undone by his own child, rescued by a street boy. The words landed like a slap across the cabin, loud and sharp enough to silence the faint hum of idle conversation. Heads turned. Some passengers gasped, others tried to pretend they hadn't heard, while a few smirked behind champagne glasses. The voice belonged to a man standing in the aisle, his presence as polished as his tailored gray suit. Hector Dane. A rival Alaric knew all too well, a name spoken in boardrooms with a mix of respect and caution. Now here he was, using a commercial flight like a stage, taunting Alaric in front of an unwilling audience. Alaric turned slowly in his seat, locking eyes with the man. His fingers gripped the edge of his armrest, white-knuckled. Every instinct in him screamed to respond, to crush the insult with a single cutting remark. Pride coiled in his chest like a spring. But before he could speak, a small sound broke through the tension. Elias whimpered. Then came a rising breath, the telltale prelude to another cry. Alaric's gaze dropped to his son, whose face was beginning to crumple again. The storm, it seemed, was not over. Darius, still holding Elias with gentle firmness, leaned toward Alaric and whispered just loud enough to be heard. "Ignore him. Your son needs calm, not anger." Alaric blinked. The voice was soft, respectful, but firm. Darius didn't speak like a servant or a spectator. He spoke like someone who understood consequences. The words sliced through the fog of rage in Alaric's mind. He looked at the boy. Really looked. Darius's expression was steady, composed, and entirely focused on the child. No trace of fear or pride, only care. Alaric exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough for clarity to return. He said nothing. Not to Hector, not to the watching passengers. He simply turned back in his seat and placed a calming hand over Elias's small back. The silence was heavier than any response he could have given. Hector raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. He opened his mouth again but found the moment had shifted. The smirks around the cabin had dulled. Some passengers even looked uncomfortable. The air, once charged with expectation, now simmered with a strange new energy. "You're losing your edge, Vainer," Hector muttered as he walked past. He paused just behind Alaric's seat, leaning down to whisper with venomous calm. "And soon, your empire." The words were meant to provoke. They were soaked in history, years of business rivalry, undercut contracts, and backroom deals. But instead of fire, Hector met stone. Alaric didn't turn. His jaw tightened, but he refused to take the bait. Elias stirred again, restless in Darius's arms, but did not cry. A quiet victory. One the cabin didn't fully understand, but felt. The irony was unmistakable. A billionaire had just taken advice from a boy in second-hand shoes. The cabin, which had moments ago bristled with subtle judgment toward Darius, now looked at him with a new kind of curiosity, if not respect. He had diffused what Alaric, with all his power, could not. Even Alaric could feel it. The shift, the atmosphere, the dynamics, all quietly rearranging themselves. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Gratitude, certainly. But beneath that, something more unsettling, a kind of awe. The boy had instincts that couldn't be taught in boardrooms or inherited with money. Alaric had built empires, outmaneuvered titans. Yet here he sat, realizing the battle that just unfolded had been won by the calm voice of someone the world would never see coming. Darius looked down at Elias, brushing a gentle thumb over the baby's cheek. "He's calming again," he said, more to himself than anyone. "Kids always sense the storm before it breaks." Alaric finally turned to him, studying the boy's face with new eyes. "You've done more than calm him," he said under his breath. "You've done something I haven't managed in years." "And what's that, sir?" Darius asked, still not looking up. "Silence the noise." The quiet stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy with meaning. Meanwhile, Hector returned to his seat, a sour look plastered across his face. He glanced around, expecting a ripple of approval, but saw none. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by a calculating squint as he studied Darius once more. Whatever victory he thought he had claimed had just been diluted. Passengers returned to their conversations, though now they threw sidelong glances not at Alaric, but at the boy. Whispers carried. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Alaric straightened in his seat, the weight of the encounter lingering. He was a man used to being the center of attention, used to dominating rooms with wealth and intellect. But here, at 30,000 feet, in a cabin thick with ego and scrutiny, it was a teenager who had quietly taken control. Not by force, not by name, but by understanding what mattered most in the moment. He wasn't sure what was more surprising, that he had let it happen, or that he didn't regret it. And yet, as he watched Hector sink into his seat, brow furrowed and lips tight, Alaric knew something deeper had been set into motion. This wasn't over. Not the rivalry, not the tension, and certainly not the story. The cabin had become a battlefield of pride, and the boy had already altered its course. The moment snapped like a whip through the cabin. "This is unacceptable. That boy doesn't belong here. First class isn't for beggars," Hector Dane bellowed, his voice slicing through the hush like a blade. Heads turned sharply. A businessman in the front row lowered his tablet. A mother in pearls drew her child closer. Even the flight attendants, mid-step, froze. The atmosphere inside the cabin shifted, from tense discomfort to barely concealed alarm. Hector stood tall, his gray-tailored suit stiff against the cabin lights, eyes locked not on Alaric Vainer, but on Darius Holt, the boy who had dared to step into a world not built for him. Darius's body tensed. Though seated only feet from Alaric, the space suddenly felt vast and fragile. He held Elias tighter, instinctively protective as the baby whimpered again, sensing the storm gathering around them. His breath quickened, heart pounding against the worn cotton of his shirt. He wasn't surprised by the outburst. He'd grown up in a world where looks like Hector's often came with sneers, but here it felt like the walls of an invisible cage were closing in. The attendants glanced uncertainly at one another. Protocol didn't prepare them for this. One took a hesitant step forward, her eyes flicking between the furious executive and the silent billionaire. Technically, Hector had no authority over seating decisions, but wealth changed definitions of influence, of power, of control. And in this cabin, both men wielded it like weapons. Alaric hadn't moved. His expression, carved from stone, betrayed nothing, yet his silence was deafening. Darius looked to him, waiting, hoping. The boy's knuckles whitened around Elias's tiny frame, as if anchoring himself against the pull of humiliation. His thoughts spiraled. If I'm forced to leave, Elias will cry again. Alaric will retreat. Everything we've built in these few short hours, gone. His objective was no longer about earning respect. It was about preserving a fragile new balance he hadn't expected to matter so much. Hector took another step closer, his voice dripping with disdain. Are you really going to let this charity case play nursemaid to your son, Alaric? Is this how far you've fallen? The insult was sharp, but it wasn't the words that stabbed, it was the passengers' reactions. Some gasped softly. Others watched with the morbid curiosity of witnesses to a car crash. Darius kept his eyes on Alaric, not blinking, not breathing. Alaric remained still. Seconds passed, then more. A baby's cry cut through the silence, shrill and rising, Elias, reacting to the rising pressure, the unspoken threats swirling around him. The attendants flinched. Darius's grip shifted instinctively, rocking the baby gently, whispering something under his breath. Elias quieted, only slightly, but enough for the tension to pulse. Alaric blinked once. Then, with a voice as cold and precise as sharpened steel, he said, "The boy stays." The words fell like a gavel. The cabin erupted, not in sound, but in sheer collective breath. It was as if a held inhale finally exhaled across the rows. The attendants nodded, stepping back immediately. One muttered, "Yes, sir," before disappearing behind the curtain with swift obedience. Hector's expression cracked. The smirk that had curled confidently at his lips wavered. His gaze darted around the cabin, expecting backup, finding none. Eyes that had once followed him were now watching Alaric with new interest, and Darius with something even closer to respect. Darius didn't move, but his entire body buzzed. Not with victory, but with disbelief. He didn't expect protection. Not here, not from a man like Alaric, but it came, not with kindness, but with power. And sometimes in the world Darius came from, that was the only form of safety that mattered. Elias shifted again in his arms, but this time there was no cry. Only a soft sigh, followed by stillness. The baby had settled once more. Beside him, Alaric leaned forward slightly, voice low, words for Darius's ears alone. "You're not just calming my son. You're silencing my enemies." The words were delivered not with warmth, but with weight. Darius didn't respond, but his grip on Elias tightened slightly, just enough to acknowledge the truth of it. Across the cabin, Hector sat down slowly, his jaw set, his eyes glinting with something more dangerous than rage, calculation. Darius didn't need to be told that this wasn't over, but for now, the moment belonged to him. And in that moment, the billionaire and the boy understood one thing clearly. This wasn't just a battle over noise or class, it was the beginning of a war. The cabin's air was no longer heavy with cries, it was thick with the scent of rivalry. A folded note slid silently into Alaric Vayner's hand like a dagger dressed in paper. Marlon Keene, the chief flight attendant, leaned in with a hushed voice, his expression tight with unease. "From the man in the gray suit," he whispered, nodding subtly toward Hector Dane, who sat several rows back, legs crossed, a faint smirk twitching at the corner of his lips. Alaric unfolded the note slowly, careful not to draw attention, but the moment his eyes scanned the words, his pulse surged. "Your empire is already mine. This flight is only the beginning." The ink was sharp, deliberate, and chilling. Each word sliced through his composure. His fingers curled around the paper, creasing it as cold panic pricked the back of his neck. He sat frozen, the noise of the plane, a low mechanical hum, suddenly distant. It wasn't just a taunt, it was a declaration. Across the aisle, passengers were settling in for the long flight ahead. Some dozed under blankets, others scrolled on sleek devices. No one knew that a corporate battlefield had just opened 30,000 feet above the world. While they whispered about the billionaire and the street boy, a far more dangerous game was underway. Alaric leaned back stiffly in his leather seat, every instinct trained to mask vulnerability. But the veil was cracking. His mind raced. What had Hector done? Was it a merger? A mass sell-off? A hostile buy-in of Vayner Systems' critical divisions? He had underestimated the man. Distracted by his son's cries, lulled into a moment of reflection by a boy's steady hands, he had let his guard drop, and now he was paying the price. A quiet voice broke through the storm inside him. "What's wrong?" Alaric turned. Darius Holt was watching him, not with nosy curiosity, but with concern. His tone was calm, his posture relaxed, but there was something in the boy's eyes, alert, sharp, unafraid, that made Alaric hesitate. He considered brushing him off, retreating into silence like he always did. But the usual strategies didn't feel right anymore. Pride, he realized, might be his greatest liability right now. Without a word, he handed the note to Darius. The boy read it slowly, lips moving silently, eyes narrowing with each word. When he looked up, the softness in his expression was gone. What replaced it was something colder, calculating, honed by experience no classroom could teach. "You can't let him think he's winning," Darius said quietly. "Not here. Not now." His voice was steady but low, meant only for Alaric. There was no grand performance, no attempt to impress. Just truth, blunt and cutting. His gaze didn't flicker and his tone didn't rise. It was the voice of someone who had seen what happened when people gave in too soon. Alaric studied him in silence, unsettled by the clarity of the moment. This wasn't the first time Darius had dealt with pressure. It showed in the way he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, as if already bracing for the next hit. Alaric recognized that posture. He'd seen it in war rooms, in boardrooms, but never in someone so young. "What would you do?" Alaric asked before he could stop himself. Darius didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped softly against the armrest as he thought. "Hector's playing for an audience," he said finally. "He wants you to react. Lose your cool. Confirm to everyone in this cabin that you've lost control." The words rang with uncomfortable truth. Alaric's fingers twitched. He remembered Hector's earlier smirks, his little jabs. It was all staged, a performance designed to push him into a public mistake. "Then what do I do?" Alaric asked, quieter this time. "You sit still. You don't blink. You act like you're 10 steps ahead, even if you're not. Make him doubt what you know. Make him fear what you're not saying." It was uncanny, the way the boy spoke, like a man who had led others through storms, not someone who had scraped his way into a charity seat. Alaric realized the truth. Darius wasn't simply gifted with children. He had a mind sharp enough to read a battlefield, even one made of suits and silence. From the corner of his eye, Alaric noticed Hector whispering to 2 passengers, both dressed too precisely to be random travelers. Plants, maybe. Stakeholders. Alaric felt the sting of realization. This flight wasn't just a ride. It was a stage. "I've been ambushed," Alaric muttered. Darius nodded. "And now you're being watched." The cabin suddenly felt tighter. Every glance, every phone raised in a casual scroll, every whisper, it all carried a second meaning now. The pressure wasn't just external. It pressed into Alaric's chest like a weight, demanding response. But beside him sat a boy who had never owned a suit, never signed a contract, and yet understood instinctively what some billionaires never learned. That power, real power, was often quiet. Alaric inhaled slowly, straightening his posture, letting the panic settle into something steadier. Resolve. He folded the note back into a perfect square and tucked it into his jacket pocket like it was nothing more than a receipt. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "Thank you, Darius." The boy shrugged. "He's trying to make you look weak. That only works if you let him." For a few moments, neither said anything more. Outside, the sky was pure night, deep, starless, endless. The cabin lights dimmed to a gentle amber hue, bathing the aisle in sleepy warmth. But beneath that quiet veneer, war had been declared. And it wasn't over land or money. It was over perception, over fear. And yet, Alaric found himself more prepared than he had expected. Not because of his advisors or his resources, but because of the boy seated beside him. A boy who didn't need a boardroom to lead. A boy who, in a world that worshipped wealth, had commanded a moment with nothing but clarity. Above the clouds, Alaric thought, a war was being declared, and the first battle was fought with silence and resolve. He calmed the baby with patience and warmth that money could never buy. The billionaire sat stunned, realizing true wealth isn't measured in gold, but in grace. If you believe compassion changes lives, hit subscribe. This is where justice begins. Hector Dane's voice sliced through the cabin like a blade. "Must be nice," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "to buy silence with money until your own child exposes the cracks." A few passengers chuckled awkwardly. Others pretended to look away, but their eyes betrayed interest. Darius Holt noticed it all, the forced laughter, the strategic placement of Hector's supposed companions who reacted a beat too quickly to his jabs. It was a performance. Every smirk, every snide comment was crafted not for Alaric, but for the audience he was carefully building. Darius leaned closer to Alaric, his voice low but urgent. "He's staging this," he warned. "He wants you to lose your temper so they'll carry a story of weakness." Alaric didn't respond at first. His eyes remained fixed on Hector, his jaw tight. The billionaire's fingers curled into fists on the armrests, knuckles paling beneath his skin. Every part of him screamed for retaliation. It wasn't just the insult, it was the design behind it, the manipulation, the humiliation. Alaric Vayner, known for precision and dominance, was being baited like a cornered animal. And he knew it. "I know," Alaric finally said through clenched teeth, the words barely audible. "But knowing doesn't make it easier." From across the aisle, Hector's expression shifted. He saw Alaric's restraint not as a strength, but as hesitation, a crack he could widen. He stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical flair. The motion drew even more attention. "I'm just surprised," Hector said to no one and everyone, "that a man who built an empire out of code can't even control a crying child." Or himself, Darius's spine stiffened. This wasn't just a corporate feud, it was a public ambush, a carefully crafted downfall unfolding in real time. Hector wasn't after the company. He was after Alaric's dignity. Then came the line that changed everything. Hector smiled with cold malice and said, "A spoiled whale of useless privilege, that's what your son is." A fitting symbol for what your company's become. Gasps erupted. A woman near the back covered her mouth. Even the flight attendants froze mid-step. The cabin's sterile air turned dense with tension. Alaric surged from his seat. His towering frame loomed, eyes burning with a rage barely held in check. His bodyguards tensed instinctively, one stepping forward, hand drifting toward the inside of his jacket, not for violence but to intercept what looked like a man seconds from exploding. But before Alaric could move, a smaller hand caught his forearm. "Sir," Darius said, standing between him and Hector. His voice was calm but commanding, his eyes steady despite the chaos around him. "If you strike him now, he wins. But if you show strength by silence, everyone will see who's truly small." Alaric blinked, caught in the moment. His breathing was harsh, uneven. He could feel his pulse in his throat. But Darius didn't waver. The boy stood there, poor, unnoticed hours ago, now the sole voice of reason holding back a storm. Silence pressed down like gravity. The entire cabin watched, their curiosity shifting slowly into respect. Alaric's shoulders heaved once more, then lowered. He stepped back, slowly, purposefully, his fists unclenched, the muscles in his jaw loosened. He sat down. Hector's smirk faltered for the first time. He had expected retaliation. He had expected to be the victim in a tale of a billionaire's meltdown. Instead, he had been robbed of the drama he craved. One by one, the passengers began to whisper, not with ridicule, but with approval. Murmurs floated through the air. "Did you see that?" "He didn't take the bait." "That boy, he stopped it." Darius quietly returned to his seat beside Elias, who stirred slightly in his sleep but did not wake. The baby's face was peaceful, as though sensing that the worst had passed. Alaric glanced sideways at the teenager who had just diffused what might have become a catastrophe. The irony wasn't lost on him. The boy who had entered the flight as an invisible nobody was now the reason he still had his public dignity intact. He didn't speak, but his expression softened. Gratitude, respect, and a quiet surrender to a truth he never saw coming. Hector returned to his seat, stiff and silent. His plan hadn't failed. It had been undone. And as the cabin's tension gave way to a strange kind of reverence, one truth settled in Alaric's chest. This boy wasn't just good with children. He was born for greater things. The battle of wills had shifted, and the poorest boy in the cabin had become the richest in influence. As dawn spilled softly through the plane's windows, casting a gentle gold across the tops of heads and tray tables, Hector Dane rose from his seat with the grace of a predator about to pounce. The steady hum of the aircraft and the rustle of passengers preparing for landing came to a halt as his voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "When we land," he announced, his tone dripping with malice, "I will ruin you, Alaric. My deal is already signed. Your empire is finished." Every movement in the first-class cabin stilled. Eyes widened. Even the flight attendants, who had mastered the art of ignoring conflict in the air, froze mid-step. A businessman dropped his pen. Someone else inhaled too sharply. The illusion of peace shattered like glass on tile. Alaric Vaynor, sitting rigid with Elias cradled against his chest, felt the sting of those words like ice seeping beneath armor. For the first time in years, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He was not just a man now. He was a father with a child to protect, a leader with an empire under siege, and a target mid-flight, with no ground beneath his feet to fight back. His mind raced. Was Hector bluffing? Or had he really gone forward with the takeover? The timing felt cruel. He had been distracted by Elias's distress, by the unexpected presence of a boy named Darius Holt. And now, as the aircraft began its slow descent toward the runway, Hector struck like a serpent. Before Alaric could form a reply, the sound of a seatbelt unclicking interrupted the silence. Darius stood. There was no dramatic gesture, no raised voice, just calm resolve in the way he straightened his spine and faced Hector with quiet strength. The contrast between them was stark. A boy in worn shoes and a creased shirt versus a man in a custom-tailored suit, polished to perfection. And yet, it was the boy who held the room. "Then why scream it here?" Darius asked, voice steady but edged with something sharper than defiance, truth. Hector blinked, visibly thrown. "If you had truly won," Darius continued, taking a step forward, "you wouldn't need to convince us. You'd already be celebrating in silence." The words didn't echo. They detonated. A ripple moved through the cabin, shocked gasps, stifled smirks, raised eyebrows. Passengers turned, not just to look at Darius, but to truly see him. Even those who had dismissed him hours ago as a background presence now shifted in their seats, watching with something close to awe. Hector's mouth twitched as if searching for a retort, but none came. His face drained of color, and he faltered where he stood. For a moment, the powerful executive looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the control he thought he wielded. Alaric stared at Darius, breath caught. There was a tremor of pride in his chest, foreign and humbling. He had expected brilliance to come from boardrooms and billion-dollar partnerships, not from a boy who had offered to soothe his son. Passengers began murmuring among themselves. "That boy just shut him down," someone whispered. "Who is he?" asked another. From the far side of the cabin, one man leaned closer to his seatmate. That wasn't just a retort. That was leadership. Alaric watched the shift happen in real time. The power in the room, once Hector's by default, had slipped quietly to Darius without effort or strategy, only presence and courage. It wasn't just what the boy said, it was how he said it, with the weight of lived experience, not rehearsed rhetoric. Elias stirred in Alaric's arms, rubbing his eyes. He looked between the two men, Hector seething and silent, Darius calm and unshaken, and then, in the simplest gesture of all, the baby smiled. It was faint, almost fleeting, but clear, as though he too sensed what had just happened. Alaric exhaled slowly, something hard and bitter leaving his body. The war was far from over. Hector's threats were real, his resources vast. But something fundamental had shifted. No longer did Alaric see Darius as a guest or a favor. He saw him now for what he truly was. Not just bold, not just wise, but essential. He leaned close, his voice low and certain, just for the boy to hear. "Your life changes today." What began as the cries of a baby had become the roar of destiny. The plane's wheels touched down with a jolt that startled even the most seasoned travelers, but it wasn't the landing that stole the breath from Alaric Vayner's chest. It was the silence that followed. The oppressive tension of the last few hours didn't lift. It simply changed location. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, his security detail moved swiftly, instinctively forming a protective triangle around him and the still sleeping Elias. But Alaric's focus wasn't on the swarm of cameras waiting outside or the political whispers bound to follow. His eyes kept flickering sideways toward the boy who had somehow changed the course of an empire at 30,000 feet. Darius Holt stood a few feet behind him, one hand clutching the strap of his tattered backpack, the other hanging stiffly at his side. His shoes, worn and cracked, rested on the polished floor with a quiet defiance, like they had no business walking among men in tailored suits and Italian leather. And yet, he stood taller than any of them. Hector Dane moved quickly, emerging from first class with calculated calm. His convoy of assistants and private guards closed in around him like clockwork. No glance toward Alaric, no farewell, just a shadow vanishing into another black SUV, leaving behind the chilling echo of his final words from the plane. "My deal is already signed. Your empire is finished." Alaric's grip tightened around Elias. The baby stirred, blinked slowly, and rested his cheek against his father's shoulder. He wasn't crying now. Somehow the storm inside him had passed, and Alaric couldn't deny the cause. It wasn't the whispered promises of luxury or the soothing of a professional nanny. It was the hands of that boy, the calm rhythm of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. They walked in silence through the glass tunnel of the jet bridge, the noise of the airport muffled behind thick walls. The sounds of rolling suitcases, overlapping flight announcements, and rushed footsteps filtered in faintly. Passengers peeled off toward their destinations, but a few slowed, lingering. Some murmured to each other, eyes trailing back toward Darius. A gray-haired man in a burgundy vest whispered to his wife, "That boy stood taller than all of us today." The words landed like a quiet thunder in Alaric's mind. He paused mid-step. Darius, walking behind, nearly bumped into him. "Sorry, sir," he said quickly, lowering his eyes. Alaric turned. The polished marble of the terminal stretched around them like a cold monument to wealth and order. Security stayed close, watching every angle, but the billionaire raised a hand, just slightly, and they fell back. He studied Darius in the soft fluorescent glow. The boy stood still, waiting. No fear now, just patience. That same stillness he had shown in the cabin, even when men with power tried to reduce him. Alaric spoke, voice low but firm. "Do you know what you did up there?" Darius hesitated. "I just helped your son, sir." "No," Alaric said. "You shifted a room full of wolves with nothing but your words. You calmed a storm that money couldn't touch, and you reminded me what strength looks like." The boy didn't smile, but something in his posture softened. "I didn't do it to impress anyone." "I know," Alaric replied. "That's what makes it real." For a moment, the terminal seemed suspended in quiet gravity. Businessmen walked by, dragging sleek luggage behind them, lost in their devices. The world moved on, but Alaric remained rooted in that instant, wrestling with a decision he wasn't used to making. Vulnerability. Trust. These were dangerous currencies in his world, far more volatile than stocks or digital assets. He could thank the boy now, hand him an envelope, or offer some small scholarship in the name of charity. It would be safe, expected. He could nod and walk away. But something in his chest pushed against the idea, like an unseen door cracking open. If he let the boy go, would he be choosing comfort over transformation? Alaric cleared his throat, adjusting Elias gently in his arm. The baby had fallen back asleep, tiny fingers curled near his father's collar. His breath was steady. "Where are you headed now?" Alaric asked. Darius looked startled by the question. "I don't really know," he admitted. "My ticket ends here. I'll figure something out. You shouldn't have to." "What do you mean?" Alaric hesitated, then took a step forward. His voice dropped, not out of secrecy, but gravity. "Walk with me." Darius blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I'm not asking as a billionaire," Alaric continued. "I'm asking as a man who just realized his world has been missing something. Someone like you." Silence followed, thick as velvet. Then, slowly, Darius nodded. Alaric turned toward the security team and gestured. They opened a path, and side by side, one in a custom suit holding a child, the other in a frayed shirt and broken shoes, they stepped into the light of the terminal's main atrium. Behind them, passengers whispered, recording more than just footage. They were witnessing the beginning of something unexpected. In the shadows of the terminal, a new journey quietly began. The glass doors hissed shut behind Darius as he stepped into the top-floor office of Vayner Systems. The carpet beneath his scuffed shoes was softer than anything he'd walked on before, yet it didn't make his steps feel lighter. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline that looked too clean, too high above the world he came from. But he didn't shrink. He stood in the middle of that polished room as if he belonged, though everything around him whispered that he didn't. Alaric Vaynor stood near his desk, arms crossed, eyes studying Darius not with doubt, but with something colder. Calculation. "I want you to meet someone," he said without ceremony. From a side door stepped Malcolm Rinn. the legendary advisor who'd helped Alaric secure 3 of the most aggressive takeovers in Silicon Valley history. Tall, sharply dressed, and visibly skeptical, Malcolm raised an eyebrow at the boy. "This him?" Malcolm asked flatly. "Yes," Alaric replied. "Darius Holt." Malcolm's gaze dropped to the boy's frayed collar and worn laces. "You're serious?" "A street kid." Before Alaric could respond, Darius spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's right. A street kid. One who's handled more pressure before sunrise than most executives do in a week." The room went silent. Malcolm tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. Alaric didn't move, his expression unreadable. Darius stepped forward, the city skyline casting a glow across his face. "You want credentials," he said. "Try being 11 and responsible for 2 younger brothers. Try figuring out which job pays enough for dinner, but doesn't get you killed walking home. I've negotiated with landlords, diffused fights, rationed food, and calmed children during blackouts, without ever losing them." Malcolm's posture shifted slightly, his arms unfolded. "Go on," he muttered. Darius didn't flinch. "Every decision I made had consequences. Every mistake cost something real. You want leadership? I had it when it meant survival. You want patience? I had it when a toddler screamed for food I couldn't afford. You want strategy?" He paused. "Try keeping hope alive when the lights go out for good." A flicker of respect, barely visible, passed through Malcolm's eyes. Alaric watched, saying nothing, though a small nod betrayed his pride. The silence stretched. Then Alaric gestured toward the window as if the world outside was a waiting battlefield. "That boy," Alaric said, turning to Malcolm, "has something no university or boardroom teaches. He doesn't panic. He doesn't bluff. He adapts." But as the moment settled, an alert pinged on Alaric's glass desk. The screen lit up with headlines from business newswires. "Hawthorne Ventures launches aggressive buyout push, targets Vayner Systems." Alaric's jaw tightened. "He's moving," he muttered. "Who?" Darius asked. "Hector Dane." Malcolm stepped forward and tapped the screen, scrolling through legal filings and leaked internal documents. "He's coordinating a full-scale offensive. Shorting your stock. Whisper campaigns. Legal threats. The works." Darius frowned. "Because of what happened on the flight?" Alaric nodded once. "He saw me vulnerable. He took it as weakness." The irony thickened in the room. Alaric had finally opened himself to someone, and now his greatest rival was ready to burn his empire down. The room buzzed with tension. Malcolm spun toward Alaric. "We'll issue a cease and desist, freeze any hostile bids." "I'll call the firm and—" "No," Darius interrupted quietly. Both men looked at him. "If you fight him the same way, you're just playing his game," Darius said. "He's banking on that." Alaric raised an eyebrow. "And what do you suggest instead?" Darius's gaze didn't waver. "You've been fighting them with money. Try fighting them with people." There was a long pause. Malcolm looked at Alaric as if waiting for him to laugh or wave the boy off. But Alaric didn't. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing at Darius as if seeing something even he hadn't expected. The silence was no longer awkward, it was heavy, like something had shifted. Alaric finally spoke, his voice low. The boardroom war had begun, and its youngest soldier carried no gold, only wisdom. The news broke before sunrise. Hector Dane had leaked confidential reports to multiple media outlets, all suggesting that Vayner Systems was facing a silent collapse. The headlines were merciless. Vayner Empire on shaky ground, whispers of financial collapse at tech giant, Alaric Vayner losing grip. By mid-morning, the company's stock had dropped 6%, and social media was flooded with speculative videos and threads dissecting the supposed downfall of one of the most powerful men in the tech world. Inside the top floor of Vayner Systems headquarters, a sleek boardroom buzzed with tension. Suits flanked the long glass table, phones vibrated with real-time updates, and eyes darted across stock trackers as numbers fluctuated like heart monitors in distress. Alaric Vayner sat at the head of the table, stone-faced, Elias's baby photo tucked discreetly inside his wallet, untouched on the table's edge. Malcolm Rinn slammed a folder down. "He planned this." Hector knew exactly when to strike. "We've got 36 hours before investor panic becomes irreversible." "We should hit back hard," one board member insisted, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "Lawsuits, restraining orders, a public denouncement, maybe even dig up some of his skeletons. People need to see blood. That's exactly what he wants, another grumbled. He's baiting us. If we overreact, it looks like guilt. Alaric's fingers tapped slowly against the table, rhythmic, controlled. He's turning the world into a mirror of doubt. If we scream, the echo becomes proof. All eyes turned as the room's glass doors opened and Darius Holt stepped in. His suit was modest, borrowed but clean, his tie slightly crooked, his shoes still worn. He said nothing at first, just took a seat beside Malcolm, who looked at him with visible skepticism. "I have an idea," Darius said quietly. The board members blinked. "A counterattack?" one asked, half smirking. "Let me guess. Pass out sandwiches and hope people calm down." Darius didn't flinch. "No. Tell the truth." A beat of silence. Alaric tilted his head. "Explain." "You've built a company off control," Darius began. "Power. Precision. But what people believe now is fear. You don't fix fear with more noise, you fix it with clarity. Hold a public forum. Face every question. Stop hiding behind PR and walls of polished silence." "Are you insane?" Malcolm cut in. "Let him answer questions on live feed?" "They'll chew him alive." Darius's voice didn't rise, but his tone sharpened. "Not if he tells the truth. Not about numbers, about people. About why this company was built, what it's been through, and where it's going. Speak to them like they matter, not like shareholders, but humans." A long pause stretched like glass between them. Then Alaric stood. "Schedule the forum." Today, Malcolm's jaw dropped. "Alaric?" "He's right," Alaric said. "They've heard the numbers. It's time they hear the heart." That afternoon, the lights of Vayner Systems' media hall flickered to life. Rows of investors, journalists, and analysts filled the space, their pens and lenses pointed toward a stage bathed in sterile white light. Cameras streamed live across financial networks and platforms. The tension was palpable. No one knew what to expect. Alaric stepped onto the stage first. His suit was perfect, his expression unreadable. He spoke briefly, acknowledging the rumors, the fear, the uncertainty. But then, to everyone's disbelief, he stepped aside. "Today, I'd like you to hear from someone who reminded me why this company exists," he said. "Darius Holt." Gasps rippled through the room. Some whispered, others stared. A few laughed, thinking it a joke. Darius walked to the microphone, each step slow and sure. He didn't clear his throat, didn't adjust the mic. He simply began. "I'm not a CEO," he said. "I'm not a board member. I've never owned a share in my life. What I've owned is responsibility, raising brothers after our father vanished, feeding them, calming them when they were scared, watching their eyes learn how to survive in a world that doesn't care if you sink." The silence was complete. This company has numbers. It has patents and buildings and graphs. But none of that matters if people don't believe in it. And you can't buy belief. You earn it. One hard decision at a time. One honest word at a time. He looked around the room, not with defiance but with steadiness. "I watched, mister. Vaynor hold his crying son on a flight, powerless. I watched him listen. Really listen. That's why I'm here. Because sometimes leadership isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about being willing to learn them." People leaned in. Even skeptics scribbled less and stared more. "When you invest here," Darius finished, "you're not just investing in market potential. You're investing in resilience, in people who won't fold, in a company that remembers who it's supposed to serve, not just those at the top, but all of us." A slow clap began, then another. Then the room swelled with applause, not polite, but rising, real, the kind that shifted tides. Malcolm watched, stunned. Investors exchanged nods. Social media feeds flooded with praise. Vayner shows heart. Unexpected voice stuns investors. Truth over tactics? From a quiet office miles away, Hector Dane stared at a live stream in silence. His smirk cracked. The narrative had slipped from his fingers, not because of Alaric's reputation, but because of a boy he'd dismissed. Back in the hall, Alaric stepped beside Darius, a rare smile ghosting his face. Malcolm turned to him, whispering under his breath, "Who is this kid?" Alaric didn't look away from the stage. "I think I've found the leader I could never be." The empire that once stood on money now leaned on something far rarer: truth. The courtroom fell into a tense hush as the opposing counsel finished laying out their final argument. an elegant trap dressed in legal terminology and peppered with just enough ambiguity to confuse the untrained ear. It wasn't just an attack on the company's contracts or board decisions. It was a coordinated effort to paint Vayner Systems as reckless, unethical, and unworthy of its position atop the industry. At the defense table, Alaric Vaynor sat stone still, his eyes scanning the rows of unfamiliar jurors, his jaw tense beneath his neatly trimmed beard. Beside him, his team of high-priced attorneys flipped through binders and tablets, preparing to respond with counterpoints, citations, loopholes, but none of it felt like enough. And then, without warning, Darius Holt leaned forward. "Let me speak," he said quietly, but with unmistakable conviction. Alaric turned toward him, surprise flickering across his face. One of the lawyers, Grant Wallace, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for never giving up the floor, opened his mouth to object, but Alaric raised a hand to silence him. There was something in Darius's tone, something urgent yet grounded. The room wasn't buzzing with noise or activity. It was that rare kind of silence before a turning point, fragile, loaded, and waiting to be broken. The judge, a man in his late 50s named Clifford Menser, arched an eyebrow. "Mr. Holt, you are not counsel of record. Are you requesting permission to address the court?" "Yes, Your Honor," Darius said, standing. He buttoned his coat slowly, the movement calm but deliberate, like a man preparing not to argue, but to testify. "With the court's permission, I would like to speak, not as a lawyer, but as someone who lives with the consequences of these decisions." Judge Menser studied him. "You understand this is highly irregular." "I do," Darius replied, "but what's happening here isn't regular. It's calculated, and I believe it deserves a human answer, not just a legal one." A pause, then a nod. "You may proceed." Darius stepped forward, walking past stunned attorneys and whispered protests. As he reached the center of the room, the spotlight from the overhead fluorescents caught the slight fray in his sleeves, the scuffed line on the edge of his shoes, signs of a journey that hadn't begun in wealth or comfort. He didn't speak from a podium. He didn't need one. "My name is Darius Holt," he began. "Some of you may have heard of me. Most probably haven't. I'm not a CEO. I don't own stock options. And until a few months ago, I wasn't even part of this world. I came from the kind of place people try to forget. But I've worked alongside Mr. Vaynor long enough to see both the flaws and the foundations of this company. And I can tell you this, Vayner Systems didn't get here by stepping on people. It got here by listening to them." His voice didn't boom. It resonated. Hector Dane, seated at the opposing table, leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled in front of his mouth. His smirk was gone. Gone was the taunting arrogance he had carried for months. He looked now like a man who realized the chessboard had shifted, and not in his favor. "The argument being made today," Darius continued, "is not about rules being broken. It's about bending perception. It's about making fear look like failure. They want to scare our investors, our clients, our partners, so that fear does their job for them. But fear only wins if we stay silent." He walked a slow step forward, locking eyes with a juror in the front row, an older man in a rumpled sweater. "My father walked out when I was 8. I had to raise 2 younger brothers alone. I've watched people lie to get what they want, pretend to help just to take more. That's what this is. This legal trap, this performance, it's dressed up in language and loopholes, but it's just another power play. One meant to crush not a company, but the people inside it." Grant Wallace watched in stunned silence. Malcolm Rinn, standing against the far wall, slowly crossed his arms and nodded with something like reluctant respect. Alaric, for his part, sat motionless, but his eyes were no longer on the court. They were on Darius, and there was a fire behind them, a quiet realization that something irreversible was unfolding. Hector stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor." "This is emotional manipulation." "Overruled," Judge Menser said flatly, not taking his eyes off Darius. "Continue." Darius turned, locking his gaze on Hector. "You say we're finished. You say our empire is collapsing. But if that were true, you wouldn't need this performance. You'd be celebrating, not screaming it in a courtroom." A murmur swept through the gallery. The judge banged his gavel lightly for order, but the impact had already landed. Darius took a breath, then stepped back. "That's all I have to say." He returned to his seat beside Alaric, who hadn't moved. After a long moment, the billionaire whispered, "You didn't just defend us. You dismantled him." The silence in the courtroom deepened. Jurors scribbled notes with renewed attention. Hector's legal team exchanged frantic whispers. Outside, the media would later replay that speech across every screen, dubbing it the testimony that turned the war. For now, though, the room remained still. The empire had been saved not with money, nor with lawyers, but with truth. The war ended not with signatures, but with a voice too honest to silence. Years later, the boardroom was quiet, filled with glass walls that stretched toward a skyline no longer ruled by one man's ambition. At the head of the long, polished table sat Darius Holt, calm, composed, and confident in a tailored navy blue suit. Around him, executives whispered updates, slid folders forward, adjusted their ties. The tension wasn't about fear, it was respect. Respect for the boy who had once walked barefoot through hardship, and now walked the marble floors of Vayner Systems as its CEO. Across the room, standing in the corner with a warm smile, was Alaric Vayner. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver, and the lines on his face were deeper, but his presence still commanded attention. He no longer led meetings. That baton had passed. Now, he observed, advised when needed, and watched with quiet satisfaction as Darius navigated the empire he had inherited, not through blood or wealth, but through grit, wisdom, and an unshakable heart. "Mr. Holt," an assistant said, handing over a last-minute report, "there's a situation with the West African Partnership." The numbers don't align. Darius took the document with a nod, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowed in thought. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. His voice, calm yet firm, silenced the room more than any shout could have. As the executives filed out, murmuring among themselves, one figure remained behind, Elias Vayner, now 17, tall and sharp-eyed, his expression full of curiosity. He watched Darius closely, not as a child watches a celebrity, but the way a student watches a master. "Why didn't you answer them right away?" Elias asked. Darius looked up, setting the folder aside. "Because urgency doesn't always mean clarity," he said, gesturing for Elias to sit. "Sometimes 10 minutes gives you the power to see what panic would have hidden." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. It wasn't the first time Darius had offered wisdom, and each time it felt more like mentorship than instruction. Outside the window, the city pulsed with life. Vayner Systems' new humanitarian wing, a project Darius had spearheaded, stood tall beside the main tower, its logo shining in the sun. Inside, children received education, fathers were trained in trades, and families found support during crises. It wasn't part of the profit model. It was part of Darius's promise that no child would suffer the silence and hunger he once endured. "Do you ever think about that flight?" Elias asked suddenly, his voice softer now. Darius leaned back in his chair, a flicker of a smile pulling at his lips. "Every day," he said quietly. "That flight was a doorway. I walked through and everything changed." "Why didn't you ever tell your story to the media?" Elias asked. Darius looked out the window, his eyes distant. "Because this," he gestured to the tower, "the people, the thriving company, this is the story. Not the crying baby, not the insult in first class." A moment of silence passed, and then Elias asked, "What made you do it?" "Help me, I mean." Darius turned toward him, serious now. "Because you were crying, and no one else could hear you the way I did." I knew that sound. I knew what it meant. I didn't help you because of your last name. I helped you because I heard my brothers in your voice. Elias lowered his gaze, his throat tightening. "I'm glad you did." A soft knock interrupted them. Malcolm Rinn, now semi-retired but still visiting occasionally as an advisor, entered the office. "Darius," he said, raising an eyebrow, "the board just voted to approve the global expansion plan." "It's unanimous." Darius stood, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Malcolm." As Malcolm left, Alaric approached slowly. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, then looked at Darius. "You've taken this company further than I ever imagined." Darius shook his head. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Alaric agreed, "but it was your vision. Your steadiness." He paused, then added with quiet emotion, "I thought my wealth would shape the world. Instead, it was your heart." Darius smiled gently, then turned to Elias, who was now standing as well. "It started with your son's cry," he said, voice full of meaning. The rest was just listening. What began as an irritation on a flight ended as a story told for generations. Minutes later, the billionaire's life shifted forever. He took the boy under his wing, and years later, that same boy became a CEO. If you stand for hope, dignity, and transformation, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of empathy, humility, and how kindness can open doors in the most unexpected ways. Its purpose is to raise awareness about the value of compassion, provoke thought about how we treat others regardless of status, and inspire action toward creating opportunities through simple acts of humanity.